stay first with your example of someone, let's say, who's really wicked. And there are wicked people. We can analyze that psychologically or
two of them are sitting right here.
Well, yeah. I mean, because it goes right through the human heart, as Solzhenitsyn said. But Thomas Aquinas says a wicked person, even the most wicked person, is seeking at least the apparent good. So something that appears good to that person. Now, they could be totally mixed up about it. It's not, in fact, good for them, but at least it appears good to them. So even the most wicked person, Thomas says, is inchoately seeking God, because it's always some good. And now he's got the wrong sense of it, but he's still being drawn and motivated by this first cause of the will, even the most wicked person. See, but I think that's a sign of hope. That means grace is always possible. Now read, whether it's Dostoevsky or Flannery O'Connor and people that talk about the most wicked types, but they're sometimes the place where grace breaks through, because they are seeking God in their perverse way. So in a way, he's got us coming or going. Whether we're Mother Teresa or we're a wicked Dostoevsky character, we're all seeking God in some way. And I agree with you about the Bible. The Bible.
Well, I'm not that optimistic, because I don't think that all evil actions are misguided. I think that and I think that's best illustrated in the story of Cain and Abel. And I took the story of Cain extremely seriously. I think it has unbelievable explanatory power. It's quite staggering, that the power of that story, the explanatory power, especially for how short it is. Cain is resentful. He has his reasons. His sacrifices were repudiated by God for reasons that aren't made clear in the text, which is a great ambiguity, because often our sacrifices are repudiated. And Cain is bitter, and no wonder. And he has Abel around to rub his nose in it as well. But Cain's reaction is, I'm going to destroy what God values most. And that, now you might say, well, Cain is conflicted and ambivalent about that, and I believe that, but I don't think he was seeking the good when he struck down. He was shaking his fist at God.
Yeah, indeed he was, objectively, but he was seeking at least the apparent good for him. In his twisted mind, he thought that was the good.
I don't believe it. I don't believe it. I think you can get to a point where you're so resentful. I really believe this, that you're so resentful that you will do harm to yourself as well as everyone else. And actively.
True, but a suicide is seeking at least the apparent good. A suicidal person thinks my non-existence is a good thing. So they are seeking the good, but in a twisted, misguided way. And to me, it's got metaphysical roots, because I would hold to the classical view that evil is a privatio boni, right? It's a privation of the good. So good is always more fundamental than evil. It has to be. They're not co-equal principles fighting away. So I'd repudiate any sort of Gnostic or Manichaean system.
I believe that too. I believe that. I thought about that a lot. Jung is being accused of Manichaeism, for example, because he took evil so seriously.
Who has? Sorry, I couldn't hear.
Carl Jung was accused of Manichaeism. But he took evil extraordinarily seriously, which is something that's definitely worth doing. So you look at examples like the Columbine killers. The suicide could have come before the murders, but it didn't. Mm-hmm. And so I even see maybe in those situations the desire for non-existence, not so much as a seeking of the good, but a desire to punish God for the inadequacy of his creation.
Yeah, no, it could be. But at least in their mind, that's a good thing. So that's the Cain connection, that the resentment against God and getting back at God. Sure, I see it in the pastoral life all the time.
It's a justified thing. They think
for them it is,
God deserves it, because look at what's happened.
But see, but God has us coming or going, because that is in fact a quest for God. That's right. I mean, even the most resistant sinner is in fact under grace in that sense. That's why I've always liked, both Origen and C.S. Lewis say this, that it's the love of God that lights up the fires of hell, right? If someone's in hell, it's the resistance to God's love that's lighting up the fires, that's causing the friction. And so God has you coming or going. I mean, is God present in hell? Sure, because whatever is has to be grounded in God. And God's even present in the fires of hell because it's the resistance against God that's causing them, you know? So I think it's a metaphysical statement and a psychological statement about the primacy of the good, but it's a source of hope. And a lot of my pastoral work, you know, and you as a psychologist too, when you go into people's pain in a very deep way, and priests go all the time to these limit situations where people have lost loved ones, they're facing their own death, they're facing tremendous failure. That's where priests go, you know, because that's often where grace is going to break through.
Well, there are, I've encountered situations as a clinician where religious language is the only language that can be used to describe what's happening. That's quite interesting. It's difficult to relay those experiences outside the specific framework of the occurrences.
Yeah. I always think of, you know, Hegel said, to know a limit as a limit is to be beyond the limit. And I think that's true here. So whether it's the physical sciences or psychology, our reason comes to a certain limit, but then it recognizes the limit as a limit. And that's to be already beyond it in a way. And they often talk about religious questions as limit questions, or it's a limit situation. When I begin to ask the meta question beyond questions, or I come to a meta experience beyond any ordinary experience. And that's why, again, priests tend to show up at those limit cases. That's when we're looking into this abyss. And it is, from our standpoint, rather abyssal. I mean, what is it that stands beyond what I can know and control? And there's this, I mean, do a Kierkegaardian, there's a kind of leap that abyss is something loving. And what stands beyond what I can control is a force of love that's actually summoning me. And that's why you go back to what I said about Deus Dixit, God speaking through the scriptures. I think that's what it means. The voice from the cloud is a symbol of it, you know? When someone hears the voice of God, it's coming from the abyss. It always is. Job, you know, the voice comes out of the whirlwind. So your eyes are closed and you can't see anything, but from the whirlwind comes the voice. And again, that speech is so important because, Job, where were you when I did all these? I mean, what do you know about what's going on? You know nothing about what's going on. But from the abyss beyond reason comes the voice. And the Bible witnesses to that stuff all the time. And boy, it happens in people's experience. I mean, you and I both know that when you come up against limits, what comes out of the abyss is a very interesting thing.
Well, one of the ways that's interesting to think about this, I think, is that, well, let's assume that at the outermost limits of your identity, you don't make the assumption that you're involved in an enterprise that's good, nested inside a being that's good. Let's say you take the opposite approach to that. What happens to your behavior? And what I believe I've observed, and I tried to document this particularly in my book, Maps of Meaning, is that you start acting in ways that make everything worse very rapidly.
Yes.
So I had a debate a while back with an antinatalist, David Benatar, and he believes that existence is so rife with suffering, conscious existence is so rife with suffering, that it would be better if it just didn't exist at all. Mm-hmm. So, and Dostoevsky's Ivan makes that case in The Brothers Karamazov brilliantly. He tortures his brother Alyosha, who's the novitiate. And it's a very interesting book because Alyosha is nowhere near the rhetorician that Ivan is, but he is the most admirable character in the book because of the totality of his personality, not because of the brilliance of his rational mind. It's an amazing book in that regard. But the problem I had with Benatar's hypothesis wasn't its axiom, because I think you can make a strong case that there's so much suffering in the world that the question of its validity is a valid question. The problem for me there is that if you do that and you start to act that out, things appear to take a vicious turn very rapidly. You start working against everything that's alive and striving.
Yes.
And
no, quite right. Gosh, there's a lot there. I was thinking of, as you were talking, the Dante's image of Satan at the pit of hell, not in a fiery place, but an icy place. Much, much better symbol of stuck.
Right. Surrounded by the betrayers.
Yeah, just chewing on the three great traitors. but his great wings, he's meant to fly. He's meant to fly up into the presence of God. But all they do is he's beating his wings. And that's our earlier point about he's seeking God. I mean, Satan is seeking God. You have to. That's the way the will functions. But all he's managing to do is make the world around him colder. So as he's beating his wings, he's creating the meteorology of hell, you know? So that's what happens when someone gets really stuck. They are in fact seeking God, and he cries from all 6 eyes. He's got 6 eyes and he's weeping and he's drooling from the people he's chewing, and he's stuck and he's making the world colder. It's a beautiful picture of what happens.
It's really useful too for listeners to realize. If you look at, this is my opinion, and you can take it for what it's worth, the images of Satan in Paradise Lost and in Dante's Inferno are unbelievably instructive. If you start to understand that what these thinkers were trying to do was to produce an imaginative representation of evil, and evil as an embodied and transcendent being, and the psychological rationale for that, I believe, and it has something to do with our ability to communicate, which you referred to earlier, is that the evil we do is informed by the entire human race's conception of what constitutes evil. Mm-hmm. And stretching back from the beginning of the time when we began to communicate. So, for example, you see this quite clearly. I read the Columbine killers' notes in quite a bit of detail, and it's saturated with satanic thought. And the reason for that is that sort of thought is part of the culture, because we've come to represent these transcendent figures of evil in poetry and in movies. And it happens all the time in movies with characters, say, like Hannibal Lecter, and in horror movies. And the Milton's Satan, who's often viewed, at least by some, as a revolutionary hero, seems to me to be something like the rational mind. It's what happens to the rational mind when it places its presuppositions in the place of God. Because Satan seems to presume that he can replace the transcendent by his own presuppositions. And I think that's my reading of that, is that's actually what happened on Earth not long after Milton wrote, when these totalitarian states emerged. It's something Solzhenitsyn commented on, where the presuppositions, the utopian presuppositions of man, rationally thought out, were seen as sufficient to represent everything, the totality, to eliminate the need for something transcendent. And the consequence of that was that they produced something that looked an awful lot like hell.
Like hell.
And Dante did that more psychologically. And so Milton, being the great poetic genius that he was, had a poetic sense that was what was coming down the pipelines.
I wonder if you read your countryman, Charles Taylor, much, the Canadian philosopher, because Catholic too. Taylor said that we in the West, so let's say Western Europe, America, Canada, Australia, we might be the first civilization ever to think you can find real happiness apart from a transcendent reference point. And everyone in human history has felt something like the alluring darkness beyond what I can control and know is necessary. A relationship to that realm is necessary for happiness. We're the first culture ever that said, no, I don't care. I'm indifferent to it. But that does produce versions of hell for sure, because something will take the place of the transcendent point of reference.
Well, it seems useful even from the perspective of humility. I mean, I don't know if this is a reasonable thing to say, but a tyrant who believes in God is likely preferable to one who doesn't, because at least in principle, the tyrant is held accountable by something that isn't him. Whereas the atheistic tyrant, that's right. He would get caught, at least in principle, again, in the operation of his own conscience.